This seems like a particularly unique topic. Richard, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a lecture, and I will hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much for asking me. I was really honoured when I got your letter, and I was especially thrilled because, of course, the great idea that we're going to be discussing today was invented in Glasgow in the early 18th century. The inventor was Francis Hutcheson, and the idea was very, very simple, that the way we judge any situation is by the happiness of the people. Are they enjoying their lives? Are they feeling fulfilled? Are they satisfied? I think this is actually the most important idea of the modern age, and has led, of course, to a much more civilized kind of society today than existed before the 18th century. So it's a huge idea, generating enormous social progress, but limited until recently by lack of quantitative evidence of what determines people's happiness. And that, of course, is what has changed with the science of happiness that's developed over the last 30 or so years, which do now make it possible operationally to make well-being the goal of government. And I'm really hoping it's going to be the goal of whichever government gets elected after this election. So let's just reflect on what that means. Now, this is the way Thomas Jefferson put it. The care of human life and happiness is the only legitimate object, meaning objective, of good government. That's a very strong statement, but I think actually it's correct. I can't anyway, think of any reason for having a government if it isn't to improve the quality of life and happiness of the people subject to the government, with one qualification. We're not just concerned with the average happiness, we're also concerned with the absence of misery. So we are giving particular attention to having no long, low tail, as well as having a good average. But subject to that qualification, I think Thomas Jefferson really hit the nail on the head. And this is totally relevant to what is to happen after the next election, because, as you know, we're going to have a spending review. Hopefully this will be what I call a zero-based spending review, where you look at everything, including things you're already doing, as well as things you might do in the future additionally. So what's the principle that should be governing the spending review? I do believe it should be the principle of what will produce the most happiness and the least misery. And that is kind of the starting point for this lecture. Now, of course, we have to persuade people, because a lot of people have got objections to this, and there are technical objections which philosophers raise. I think some of these objections have to be taken seriously, but quite frankly, if you can find a better principle than this one, unless you can find a better principle than this one, this is the one that you should be following. So this is the justification which I always give if asked, why do I think that happiness should be the sole ultimate overarching criterion.
She's in one of those rooms.
So there are obviously many goods.
But I think she's only just...
There's wealth, there's health, there's freedom, many things are good. But you can always ask the question, why are they good? Why is wealth good? Why is health good? And you might find yourself giving answers like, well, people feel better if they're reasonably well off, or if they're healthy, if they're free. But if you ask, why does it matter how people feel? You can't give any answer. And I think that this is a very powerful argument for why taking what people feel as the measure of the overarching objective for a society. How do people feel about their lives? And I'll come on to the exact measurement of that in a moment. But let's just go on to what this says about the spending review, because I want to be very practical about this, and you will see how relevant this is to health, the claims of health, and especially mental health, for more money in the spending review. So the way always to think about the maximisation of well-being, I think, is to think that there's some sort of fixed budget against which this has to be done, and this is, of course, then as relevant to a small unit or a non-governmental organisation as it is to the government as a whole. But assuming the tax policy is decided that by some other process, then you've got to choose your spending to maximise happiness. Now, that is obviously over a period of time. Anything you do now may have future implications. So you've got to take into account the impact on well-being in future as well as present time, measured in terms of well-being per year added up over all years. And then you're maximising the sum of that subject to the budget constraint. And I'll come back to the misery issue at the end of my talk. So if you do that, if you follow that line, you're going to be choosing policies with the highest benefit cost ratio until you've exhausted all the money. So you're going to go down the scale of policies, and I'll show you some later, according to their benefit cost ratios until you've spent all the money. And you've got to be very clear in your mind what you mean by benefits and costs. By benefits, you mean how it changes people's lives. That's the benefit to the public. By cost, you mean the thing which is in short supply, the thing was subject to the budget constraint, which is the money that the government has to shell out. And obviously, if having shelled it out, there are then flowbacks because the way you've spent the money produces less crime or less claims on the National Health Service or whatever, you've got to subtract that. So it's the benefit per net cost that you're trying to evaluate for all the possible policies that the government could be following. Now let me just comment on how maximising well-being years relates to the existing form of cost-benefit analysis that all of us are familiar with, and which I wrote a book about once very many years ago. In traditional cost-benefit analysis, well-being is measured in money terms, and it's measured by willingness to pay. So that includes, obviously, simple changes in income, but also willingness to pay, where you can value something like time, for example, by how much people are willing to pay to choose a shorter journey. And that's what we call revealed preference. And what you'll see straight away is if you're doing the measurement of benefits in that way, there are all kinds of things which are really important to people's well-being, which can't be valued that way because they're not chosen. I mean, if you're unemployed, involuntary unemployment, you don't choose whether you find a job. You have to be looking, but that's not enough. You either get or don't get a job. If you're robbed in the street, you didn't make a choice. If the environment is polluted, you didn't get a choice. So there are so many other key things affecting people's happiness, which are missing from traditional cost-benefit analysis, but where now, because of the science of well-being, we can get direct measures in units of well-being. So let me come on to what are the units of well-being. We use the answers to this question. This is the first of the ONS questions, which I have to admit we suggested and have been asked ever since 2011 on a very regular basis of a very large sample by the ONS and are published quarterly nowadays. But this is a question that's been asked in America now for 70 years or so. We know an awful lot about the properties of the answers to this question. I'll just read it out. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? And a scale 0 to 10 with the ends described. Now, how do we know that people are answering these questions in a consistent way, which enables us to compare people and thus learn something about what causes well-being? We know perhaps the most obvious reassurance comes from the fact that the way people answer these questions are very good predictors of many other things. For example, this is as good a predictor of life expectancy of people aged over 50 over the next 9 years, as is the result of a medical examination. It's a very full of information question. It's quite a good predictor of productivity differences. My colleague Jan Donevi studied that, quitting. But also, which is highly relevant, of course, to politics, is it's a highly effective predictor of whether the government will be re-elected. So my colleague George Ward did a study of national elections in European countries since the 1970s and showed that the answers to this question were better predictors of whether the government would be re-elected than the answers got by studying the state of the economy. So it's not the economy stupid, as I think a Clinton aide once said, and is sometimes said by people going into the present election. It is actually going to be the satisfaction, life satisfaction of the people, which determines the outcome of this election, which is, of course, partly affected by the economy, but also by many other things, as we all know in our own lives. But I think that this voting result is pretty important because if you're asking what's the chance of persuading politicians that they should be maximizing well-being, the best reason to give to them is, well, that's the way to get re-elected. So let me go back to what we're trying to do. We're trying to maximize well-being. Obviously, over time, it's got to be discounted. We use the Treasury discount rate of 1.5%. And then we're going to be applying it to the spending review and the analysis of public expenditure. That's what my talk is going to be about. But of course, it should in principle be applied to the tax structure and to the structure of regulation. You are, most of you, engaged in health research of one sort or another, as I understand it. And of course, you recognize straight away this is not that different from QALYs. NICE essentially are charged with recommending whether to accept treatments or not, according to whether they generate sufficient QALYs per pound of cost. So this is very similar to that, but we're trying to now apply it across the whole board. And as you'll see, this is going to be very helpful to the health sector because it's going to enable you to compare the benefit cost ratio from health innovations to the benefit cost ratio from, for example, building roads. And I'll show you some numbers in a moment. So what we're talking about is a better benefit cost analysis where we're having to obviously accept the measurements which are made in money, which can be made in money and are best made in money, but we're going to add to them those benefits which are measured in units of well-being. So the question is, how are we going to add together benefits in well-being units and benefits in money units? And what we're going to do is to do what the Treasury Green Book now says. And one reason we're going to do this is that we are the people who persuaded the Treasury to change the Green Book to make possible the use of direct evidence on well-being. So here's what happens. Rather than turning money into well-being, we're going to turn well-being into money, using the Green Book value of a well-being. We're doing it this way because having talked to many civil servants at the top and lower, they are more likely to respond to benefit cost ratios where the numerator is in money, because that's what they're used to. So in terms of the ranking of policies, it doesn't make too much difference whether you turn money into well-biz or well-biz into money, obviously. So we're going to be turning the well-biz into money and then adding them to any money values that have also been estimated. So what's the chance that the Treasury, after the election, is going to do this sort of thing? Well, this is what Keir Starmer said in his first conference speech. With every pound spent on your behalf, we would expect the Treasury to weigh not just its effect on national income, but also its effect on well-being. So we've got some genuine support from the top there if Labour wins the election. I wouldn't put it quite that way. It's not measuring in two different ways. It's measuring in a comprehensive way and adding together measures obtained in two different ways. But it's the right spirit. And I think that it's what we should all be very much pushing for after the election. So to encourage this to happen, our little group of five of us at LSE in the Centre for Economic Performance, we have been for some months now engaged in what we call Wellbeing Value for Money project to show that you can apply this method to policies of any kind in any department, and they really throw light on how important or less important different things are in our lives in a quantitative way. You see, one reason why cost-benefit analysis is not used in decision-making as much as we would like it to be is precisely because it leaves out so many of the things that politicians know matter to people. But if we can put them in quantitative terms, then we've got a real chance of persuading the government to engage in what I would call rational, consistent decision-making, where you are taking one single objective and judging all the claims on money in terms of their impact on that one single objective. And that will be a wonderful moment. So I will, the next little bit of this talk, I will tell you just some of this is very, very provisional, and I wouldn't want you to quote it, but it'll I think, encourage thought, and hopefully some of you to do this sort of work. These are some of the results that we've been getting. So because I've been involved in mental health, especially the provision of psychological therapy for some years, we're starting on mental health in the list that I'm going to go through here. So I was involved in arguing for and helping to develop what's now called NHS talking therapies, which is psychological therapy for anxiety and depression, with a trained workforce trained to deliver evidence-based, NICE recommended therapies, measuring outcomes session by session so we know what we're getting as a result. When we originally made the case for it to Tony Blair, we argued that this would pay for itself in savings because more people would be able to work, pay taxes and come off benefits. And that has proven to be the case. And in our report that we're going to publish in September, we'll give the numbers on that. So that's the background for something which costs nothing, and therefore, if it provides positive benefits, should obviously be provided. But well, one of the features of NHS talking therapies is that they don't take people who've got addictions to alcohol, drugs, or gambling, nor personality disorder, or psychosis, or bipolar conditions, all of which are meant to be receiving psychological therapy if NICE guidelines are followed. But I think in none of them are more than 10% or fewer getting any. So we are proposing a new
Sorry to interrupt.
parallel service, parallel to NHS talking therapies for anxiety and depression, for addiction, personality disorder, and severe mental illness.
Richard, interrupt. I think your slides are not moving on. I think you may be on a. Sorry.
Well, we're about to move on. Can you see that?
That's we're now on the alcohol addiction slide. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So we're going through all the different conditions for which treatment needs to be provided, psychological therapy, if NICE recommendations are carried out, and valuing the results, expected results based on evidence of trials, and setting them against the costs. So here, this is just as an example. We've got measures of recovery rates and, of course, relapse rates and natural recovery rates. Give you a measure for the suffering of the patient and the suffering of the family. This is using the data on life satisfaction of people with either alcohol problems themselves or relatives with them from the survey called Understanding Society that you probably all know. So that gives you a measure of benefit when you turn those life satisfaction measures back into money using that Green Book valuation of a well-being year. The cost of the treatments recommended by NICE is about 1,200, and then you've got the savings in taxes and benefits, some savings to the NHS and some savings to the criminal justice system. So the net cost turns out to be very small, and you can see the benefit cost ratio there is about 22. So there's a high ratio of benefit to cost. And then we're going on doing these calculations for other elements in that service. But the interest of this is that we're comparing this, as I said a few minutes back, with completely different things, like what is the value of the road programme or the rail programme. So now let me give you a sort of overview of where we've got to on that general conspectus. So first, here are some policies with no net cost to the government. As I said, NHS talking therapies. We've also looked at the placement and support for people with mild to moderate mental illness that was announced by Jeremy Hunt recently. That also seems to have every prospect of paying for itself. I've done an exercise on the Green Belt, which of course involves no cost but massive benefits. But let me now go on to actual benefit cost ratios. So here's the one we just did, psychological therapy service for addiction. I looked at a number of policies in other areas, and that's what we've done as a team, in the hope of finding, obviously, places where you might find a case for some savings, which we could use to pay for the extra services which we think are required. To my surprise, R&D tax credits turned out to be much more beneficial than I'd expected, and so did more police. The way we get police, as you can imagine, is we find out what the police numbers do to crime, and then what does crime do to well-being, and then we multiply it up. Low traffic neighborhoods are also rather cheap policy with big benefits. And here are some more areas that we're going to investigate, where we, on the whole, are expecting to find high benefit cost ratios. Now let's come on to some where we have found very low ones, quite low for the placement and support of severe mental illness, obviously because of the lower recovery rates and the longer period for which they need support. The pension age is an obvious way of raising money. If you raise the pension age by a year, you save something like £6 billion. And the question is, how much well-being do you lose? Fortunately, there's evidence on that from the last time that the state pension age was raised. And that enables us to say that the benefits relative to the cost, if you delayed the raising of the state pension age, would be very low. Winter fuel allowance, obviously, is just a transfer payment, so it's kind of one for one. But then we get to road building 3, the Lower Thames Road crossing 1.2, our dear friend the HS2 1.3. So there are some things which are pretty low, which if money is short, you would think might have to yield up some money to pay for things where the benefit cost ratio is high. Anyway, that is the fundamental thrust of what we're trying to do, and what I think, you know, a whole range of people across the social sciences ought to be doing. I mean, this is a major task for social science, to come up with these numbers to inform rational government. I just want to end by talking about 2 or 3 more issues. So the first one I won't spend long on, the alternative measures of benefit. I mean, obviously, you could keep the measure of benefit in units of well-being, and you could turn any income changes that accrue to different sections in the community into well-being, using evidence, empirical evidence, on what we call the marginal utility of income, the impact of income on well-being at the margin. And that would be, in my view, a preferable way of doing it. But as of now, civil servants are not ready to look at it, and therefore let's not make the best the enemy of the good. Let me come on now to misery, which I'm sure a lot of you are very concerned with, and probably most of you would agree with me that the original Benthamite position, which I think Francis Hutcheson probably had also, was too limited. That was that you just add up happiness across everybody without any reference to how far it's unequal across people, and indeed how many people are below an acceptable level. I don't think that is how we should make policy. So therefore, what we should be doing is looking at benefits and showing policymakers benefits broken down according to the initial happiness of the people who are receiving the benefit. And obviously, one of the cases for helping people, including with severe mental illness, is that they are very, very near the bottom of the distribution. So the first obvious way is to simply use what I said before, but then show how the benefits are broken down according to the happiness or misery of those affected. And you could, of course, have a weighting system for adding those up if anybody could agree on such a thing. And I actually think there's a great research project to be done on that. Another way you can be sensitive to misery is obviously to particularly concentrate on new policy development in areas which are accounting for the greater part of the misery in society. And we've got plenty of evidence of which those areas are. So this is well, you can find this in many, I tend to use the same diagram in more than one book. You can find this in many places, including where it says at the bottom there, the textbook that I wrote recently with Jan de Navy. Now, this I think is very, very persuasive, and policymakers, they just do not think like this at all. But it's entirely an empirical question of who are the most miserable people in our society. And we can tease it out, obviously, because there's a degree of correlation between these causes. We can tease out the independent effect of each of these different factors. And there you will find that health, mental first and then physical, these are the two biggest causes of misery in our society. And I really think we should use a diagram like this to confront policymakers who assume that poverty is the main cause of misery, and therefore they don't pay proper attention to the support that individuals need with other aspects of their life. So first comes health, then comes, I would say, aspects of human relationships, whether you have a partner, what your work is like if you're in work, which is largely to do with relationships with your boss in particular, whether you have work, which is largely a matter of having a relationship with society, and then income. So you're all in the right job working on health if your aim is to reduce the misery in our society. And then the other sort of big issue, which is always is kind of the elephant in the room, is climate change. I don't think that this well-being approach that I'm pushing can, with looking at benefit cost ratios, can be applied to climate change. It seems to me that we've taken a decision about net zero and the path to it. The only role that well-being has to play is to encourage people to think about achieving that decision, that outcome that's been decided in the least cost way. And I don't honestly think that people working in the well-being industry have got much comparative advantage on this. But of course, where any policy we're looking at does have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, we should be valuing that. And we're researching currently what number to put on that. So I'm going to stop pretty much now. I just wanted to do a bit of advertising. You can find Well, in the lockdown, I thought, what can I do which is useful? And I rang various people up and said they should be writing a textbook on well-being, and they did. They all said they didn't want to. So I thought perhaps I should, and I enlisted Jan de Navy as a co-author, and this is available on open access, so you don't even have to pay for it. And if you're interested in this way of thinking, which I think is a really important backup to health economics, do have a look at that, and see if you agree with this approach. The only other thing I want to say is that there are various organisations that are pushing for all of this. There is a movement which we founded 2 years ago called the Wellbeing movement, which is based in Jan de Navy's research centre in Oxford. Do go into their site. It's still getting going, but I think that this has a huge role to play in persuading the media and policymakers to change their whole way of thinking about policy choice. We're also trying to do this at world level. So at a World Happiness Summit meeting in Como last year, we launched something called the Como Wellbeing Manifesto. And on the back of that, we're trying to put pressure on this meeting this coming September in New York of the world heads of government at the so-called Summit of the Future that is being led by the Secretary General, and wanting to get into the manifesto a sentence somewhere that says that the purpose of government is the well-being of the people. So if you're interested in the Wellbeing Manifesto, please go to that site, sign it. And then I did just want to mention the other half of the great idea of Francis Hutcheson. Obviously, if what matters is the happiness of those affected, that's the goal for government, but it's also the goal for everybody else. And it's the fundamental principle of moral philosophy that you should lead your life to try and create as much happiness as possible. So some years ago, we founded this movement called Action for Happiness. It has a pledge that people take that they will try in their lives to create as much happiness as they can and as little unhappiness, which is not easy. And it has wonderful courses, some individual, some group courses, in that the evidence base for how to live in that way. And we evaluated the group course, and we found it changed people's happiness as much as getting a job or getting a partner did. So I do think that the great idea, the great 18th century idea, can transform our civilization, not only by changing the behavior of governments, but by changing the behavior of each of us. Thank you very much. Shall I switch this off?
Perfect. Yes, thanks, Richard. And so I'm going to...
Did you hear everything?
We did, just perfect. Perfect. Right, how do I get everybody back on? Or maybe we'll leave it like that because people have got questions. Yeah. We've got some time for questions, so and I can transfer the questions. Has anybody got questions online? If people want to put questions in the chat, I can actually have a look at that as well.
Hi, I've got a question. So I'm graduating this summer with my undergraduate economics degree, and this is exactly the type of work that I would be interested in pursuing. So I was wondering if you have any advice for how, as a sort of entry-level position, can I go and pursue this field?
Well, I mean, there are very good master's courses on this now, including one at LSE. So yeah, I mean, I think that you probably should study it before you practice it. But of course, then there are lots of groups now dotted around in the civil service who are employing people doing this type of analysis. Similarly, in NGOs, there are groups that also that support NGOs in how to do this better than they currently do. In business, of course, there's also a big interest in well-being, partly because of the evidence that well-being affects productivity, but also partly because of this new ethical climate connected with what they call the ESG movement, which is environment, social, and governance. So the social bit is about the importance of the well-being of workers, especially. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of levels at which you can do it. But if you're at all academically minded, I think you should study it first.
Thank you.
Richard, so a couple of questions from our online group. So Naveed asking about to what extent obesity is a factor in your thinking. So Naveed comments that treating obesity is much more expensive, but likely upstream for much of the morbidity that we're seeing and misery. So is obesity something which is factored into your policy evaluations?
Well, obesity is, of course, a major problem, though I think it's the case that the effect of obesity on life expectancy is about the same as the effect of depression. So even if you're just thinking of life expectancy, mental health is a big issue. And of course, there's also some correlation between mental health problems and obesity. But we're not studying obesity as such.
And so another question, what's your thinking about quantifying and accounting for the well-being of future generations in our analyses and handling trade-offs between the well-being of those alive now versus those who will have to live with the consequences of our current decisions?
Well, I think that the question of why we should care about future generations is intimately bound up with Francis Hutcheson's proposition, which is essentially that everybody matters equally. However, of course, there's uncertainty attaching to the future, and that's the reason for applying this rather low discount rate, 1.5% per annum, to the well-being of either us or future generations in years to come. Yeah, I think well, all ethical systems sort of aspire to this idea that everybody matters equally. But I think that the utilitarian view is a much simplest expression of it, that it matters equally whether somebody is happy, whoever they are.
Thank you. And another question. So do you think that the short-term funding policies employed by governments are barriers to governments investing in well-being? And how do you think this narrative could change?
I think there is an unwillingness to look ahead. And of course, there's been an unwillingness often in the Treasury to accept arguments about future cost saving. Some probably sometimes justified, but often not not justified. So, yeah, I think that there is a lack of long-term thinking. I know that Gus O'Donnell, the former Cabinet Secretary, is making a very strong case now that the spending review should be a 10-year spending review rather than a 5-year one, obviously, where you update the first 5 years every 5 years, but that you do look further ahead in order to give yourself room to build structures rather than just take these short-term initiatives. I mean, Britain has been terrible, and perhaps the worst of all countries in sort of feeling we must do something. So what can we do next year? And you come up with some little scheme that you can do next year, and within 2 or 3 years that scheme's disappeared and somebody's produced another one. This is an absolutely hopeless way of running a country. I mean, I worked for David Blunkett part-time, and I was shocked by that type of thinking in the civil service. Somebody raises a problem, and then they think, well, what can we do next year? So I always said, don't even think about that. Think about what would we like to have done by 5 years from now, and then let's set about how do we get there. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay, so a philosophy question. So many of the issues you've alluded to, for example, how to weigh up different distributions of goods across people or future goods versus present goods, have been worked on in moral and political philosophy for a long time. And there's a wealth of knowledge in those disciplines about both solutions and pitfalls. And the questioner is curious about whether you have done or know of any cross-disciplinary studies involving academic philosophers.
Well, I mean, there are philosophers who have worked on this, and the name of the one who's written the fattest book escapes me at the moment. But if you write to me, I will put you in touch with that book, because that treats the whole of this subject for 400 pages in a philosophical and a mathematico-philosophical way, and it's probably the best treatment that I'm aware of.
So another question, which you, I think, might have touched on at the beginning, but is happiness a relative term? So particularly when people are asked in surveys on how happy they are, they tend to rate this in connection with how they think all others are doing. How can this be captured so it's comparable across time and contexts?
Well, if you think what would be implied if that were the case, you would expect the average happiness reported in every country to be the same, wouldn't you? But in fact, the average happiness ranges from nearly 8 in Scandinavian countries to under 3 in Afghanistan, and there's just a huge spread in ways that you would think are perfectly easy to expect and to understand. So it's obvious people are not mainly comparing themselves with each other, or they're not comparing themselves with people in the same country.
Thank you. Another comment, inspiring, thank you. You speak of a rational government being key to implementation of well-being. We have found as recently as COVID that politicians were not only irrational, going against the advice of what was suggested by scientists. How would you suggest we as scientists could continue to challenge this whilst remaining hopeful?
I didn't understand that. Maybe you could read it again.
So you speak of rational government being the key to implementation of well-being or well-being policies. So I guess your argument is that a rational government should be based on well-being as its priority. But the question Rishika is asking, saying, well, we found that particularly during COVID, for example, that politicians were not only irrational, but going against the advice of what was suggested by scientists. How would you suggest that we as scientists could continue to challenge this rational government whilst remaining hopeful?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, the first point to say, obviously, the only thing one could say about rationality, I think, is that you can't. I made the point anyway, but that you can't really hope to have a consistent set of policies without a single objective function. The second point is I think that objective function should be well-being, and I gave some reasons for that. And I also argued that nobody has come up with anything that could remotely be as plausible as that. But when it comes to COVID, we actually did do a well-being analysis of when to come out of COVID. We did try and put into the scale not just life, but also income, benefits of education, social life, and so on. So yeah, I mean, there was a debate, but I don't know how scientists can be more influential. I don't know. I think, I mean, there's obviously been a problem, I would have said on SAGE, that it was lacking in social science, other than sort of behavioral science. It was lacking in a social science that represented the value of things other than essentially life itself.
Right, and I think this is a comment, perhaps, from Victoria Lee, who says she's a cold-faced GP. The way that the current NHS is being run is directly impacting the well-being of those trying to limp it along, and therefore their ability to support the well-being of their patient. She adds that addiction is often a way, unhelpful, self-evidently, of individuals trying to improve their own well-being in at least the short term.
Sorry, is that a comment or a question? I didn't quite get the question.
It's a comment, really, and whether you have any reflections, but I guess it's a comment.
Yes, can I say, John, I've seen Eugenio Proto's name flashing up. He is a colleague in the Wellbeing fraternity. If we can have his question be helpful.
Yeah, Eugenio has been posting some information about the course. So Eugenio, do you want to chip in?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was looking somewhere else.
I just said I wanted to hear from you.
I'm fine. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Is there any question? Sorry, I can you please spell the question again? Or the comment again?
No, your name flashed up in the chat, I think.
Yes, I wanted to put forward this MSc in behavioral science that we have activated with psychology.
Yes.
And, on my course of behavioral introduction to behavior, I dedicate a few hours on well-being analysis. Yeah. So this was mostly in response of the student who was asking.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, good.
Okay, so that was my comment.
I mean, there are a number of places. I'm afraid I just mentioned the LSE Warwick has certainly has got courses, and I think City University, East London, many have courses.
But now that can I ask a question now that you call me? Or am I allowed? Sorry, the chair of the place.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So, Richard, my experience nowadays is a bit, I'm going very much on that direction to say well-being indexes are a great measure for policy, but in order to understand human behavior, I'm still struggling to see how they can exactly be used academically. Recently, I mean, there are a lot of contributions showing that while they clearly convey information, it's not very clear what is convey information about well-being. It's not very clear this kind of link between utility and happiness that we started with, right? You were one of the proposers of this. I wanted to ask if your position has changed a bit on this.
Well, I mean, I obviously human behavior is a very complicated phenomenon. So, I mean, I know I started in my first book by pointing out that many things that we do because we like them are conducive to the survival of the race, of which reproductive activity is the most obvious, but eating and many other things. But of course, we do we do some things because we feel they're right, even if we don't feel completely. We don't exactly enjoy doing them. So to explain, well, ethical behavior, I mean, is a whole field, obviously, that's developed. There may be some genetic basis for it, and maybe in cooperation looks as if it's important again for our survival. But the other puzzle, obviously, is when we do things which are bad for us and not particularly good for anybody else either. So addiction is one very obvious example of where people do things which that aren't good for them, either because they didn't forecast the effects correctly, or because of some more complicated process once they're trapped in the addictive behavior. So yeah, I mean, there's no simple statements to be made about the relation between behavior and well-being, I don't think.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Great. All right. I'm just aware we're creeping around to 2 o'clock, and so we perhaps should draw this to a close. I know there are a few other questions or comments, and obviously a chat discussion going on there, but that looks like a active discussion. So I think we should probably draw to a close, unless anyone in the room has a final or urgent question. One question, one last question, or in the room, maybe 2 quick questions if they're quick at the back. Okay. Yep.
I just wanted to say that coming at this a little bit differently, I do lectures on the history of political thought, and I finish my Aristotle lectures with you. You may not be aware of this, but Aristotle has a very complex, nuanced articulation of happiness as the ultimate aim and end of human life. And relevant to today's topic, he is absolutely conclusive that the aim of government should be to promote the happiness of the population, not security, not trade, not those other things, but happiness.
Well, of course, he made a huge contribution, and he is probably the originator of the 18th century Enlightenment, because the Nicomachean Ethics is actually a remarkable work in psychology. There is, however, a debate amongst well-being people about whether they want to be thought of as being Aristotelian or not. And you probably know that there are some people who don't like the life satisfaction definition of well-being, and would rather have a definition something like, is your life worthwhile? Meaning something like, is it an example of civic virtue of the kind that Aristotle favored? So I think personally that Aristotle did a huge favor, but he also slightly muddied the waters by saying that virtue is an absolutely inseparable element of individual happiness. I wouldn't put it that way. I would say that virtue across the community is very important to happiness at the level of the community. But the virtue is a means to an end. It's not a part of the definition of the end. So there's that little bit of difference there. But no, I worship Aristotle. Amazing.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you for everybody joining online, and especially Richard. Thank you so much for doing this lecture. I think today, obviously, you've covered psychology, philosophy, economics, politics, and a lot more. And that's actually reflected in the people that have attended this session today from certainly across our university and different departments. And so, reflecting that what you're talking about is bringing together people from all sorts of different disciplines and let's hope that whatever government we end up with next indeed places well-being as its core objective. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you all for your questions.